Cool. Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. This, I should say up front, this talk is kind of like a Frankenstein of 5 different talks I've given, slapped together in a slightly weird way. And I'll play it a bit fast and loose with the slides and what I say and like questions along the way. It'll be a bit workshop-y and stuff. Okay, so this talk is going to be on arguments for and against investing in efforts to make, aggregate, and use existential risk estimates, along with challenges and best practices. And first, a terminological note. I imagine most of you know this, but just in case not, existential risk basically means something that would irreversibly, substantially reduce humanity's long-term potential, the potential for value in the world. So this could be extinction, but also like permanent collapse or a permanent dystopia, which doesn't have to be 1984, just anything that's much less good than what we could have achieved. And so I think this talk should be relevant to you in 2 main ways. Firstly, because I think these estimates should probably be an input into your decisions. Secondly, because I think you could contribute to efforts to make, use, or aggregate such estimates, or to figure out the pros and cons and best practices for doing so. For example, you could do forecasting work on this sort of thing, or you could do research on how to do such forecasting, or how to get that forecasting used in policymaking. A third, less important reason is a lot of people in the EA and long-termist and existential risk communities are using this kind of thing. So it's sort of helpful to know why they do so and what this is to help understand the decision making. But that matters less than the first 2 of you using it and you contributing. Okay, so decisions you might need to make to motivate the case for this. Let's say you believe that the well-being and flourishing of people who could exist in the future matters just as much of that of people who are alive today. And let's say you're also lucky enough to have $1 billion just burning a hole in your pocket. What are you going to do with it? This is not purely hypothetical. There are at least 2 people who are billionaires and do want to work on these things. They have a lot of money by normal standards of like, I like video games and sandwiches. $1 billion, that's enough for all the video games and sandwiches I need. But not enough money to solve all the existential risk problems. So how are they going to do it? And also, money and actions and policies can make things worse. How are they going to avoid that? So in this situation, maybe you should fund work aimed at reducing existential risk or X risk. But is it really what you should prioritize? Or is X risk perhaps low enough already, or too intractable to change, that you should focus on something else, like alleviating farmed animal suffering or global poverty? And if you do focus on existential risk, which risks? For example, nuclear risk, bio risk, AI risk, climate change, asteroid risk, something else? Which broad bucket do you focus on? And which specific pathways? For example, within nuclear risk, do you focus on risks from nuclear war worsening geopolitics? So maybe there's a nuclear war that happens, and that means that other international relations issues are handled worse, and maybe that makes bio risk or AI risk worse? Or do you focus on nuclear winter, where a huge amount of smoke being produced basically blocks the sun and changes the climate for several years and leads to huge famines? Or do you focus on the risk from tens of thousands of warheads being used, where potentially the direct impacts could be close to extinction level? Those are just some. There's others as well. These different pathways have different interventions that help, and some interventions that help for one of them harm for another pathway. Do you focus on US-Russia conflict, or US-China, India-Pakistan, which flashpoint? These are all decisions you need to make to inform your efforts to make this matter better. And the same would apply to AI, bio, etc. And which interventions? So for example, you could focus on no first use, where a country pledges that their only scenario in which they use nuclear weapons is if they or an ally have been hit by nuclear weapons first. Or you could focus on new arms control agreements, but if so, between who, and focusing on what reductions or controls. Or switching arsenals to smaller, more accurate nuclear weapons, possibly more of them, but a smaller number that can more accurately hit their targets. This might be good because it could reduce nuclear winter, because you don't need to just have huge bombs hitting cities. You can have smaller targeted bombs hitting just the militarily relevant target without as much smoke. All of these things could be great, could be terrible. They could just be a sort of meaningless, pointless waste of money. Which one is it? These are very tough prioritization decisions. So yeah, these sorts of prioritization questions are core to effective altruism and are just as relevant if you happen to not have $1 billion burning a hole in your pocket. For example, each of you could probably have a quite impactful career. How should you choose to use it? For another example, I previously did research on risk from nuclear weapons, but I'm now focused more on reducing risk from AI. Was pivoting like that the right call? Should I pivot back to nuclear risk or to something else? And I know people who care about EA principles and who could probably influence major decisions by the US, UK, or Australian government. What types of decisions should they influence, and in which direction should they push them? They can make things different, and in which direction would that be useful? And note this is both about what's actually net positive, because working on these things in certain ways could make matters worse, and also about what achieves the most impact per resources spent, where resources could be money, could be political capital, could be time, could be something else. There's a lot of factors that go into answering these questions, including moral beliefs and personal fit. For example, the reason for the pivot from nuclear risk to AI governance for me was basically personal fit. I think both issues are about as important on the margin for a new EA-aligned person, because AI is more important, but there's more EAs working on AI stuff. But for me, there was personal fit reasons to go this way. And that's the reason why existential risk estimates matter less, because it's partly about moral beliefs, partly about personal fit. But nevertheless, I still believe that one of the pivotal sets of factors that should inform these prioritization decisions is how likely various risks are, how likely various pathways are, and how much various interventions reduce them. So that's my claim. That's what motivates me to be here talking about this, basically. So to further flesh that out, here's some examples of crucial questions that could require these estimates, where these estimates are helpful. How likely is nuclear war in the next 10 years? How likely is nuclear war involving at least 100 detonations on cities? If nuclear war is mostly just silos in rural areas where the ICBMs are, that has way less nuclear winter risk because there's way less smoke produced. So whether it's mostly on cities or not makes a big difference, regardless of how many weapons are used and where the nuclear war happens. How likely is the collapse of civilization due to nuclear war? I'll skip that one. How much of this risk comes from US-China, US-Russia, US-North Korea, India-Pakistan? How much comes from accidental versus deliberate versus inadvertent first strike? So is it like is it a false alarm? That's the inadvertent one, where someone thinks they've been struck first. They haven't actually. They strike back, but it was a false alarm. Or is it just purely an accident? Or is it them deliberately choosing to strike first? And which interventions overall reduce rather than increase nuclear risk? By how much do they do so? And how much would they cost? This is just in nuclear risk. This is a subset of all the key questions in nuclear risk. Other issues have their own ones. This is just to give you a flavor of these are really important questions if you're deciding whether to focus on X risk, whether to focus on nuclear, what to do within nuclear, and there's equivalent ones for any other area. And one way to answer them is existential risk estimates. I put a little asterisk to note in expectation for how much these things reduce the risks, because what really matters is not just some sense of how likely are they to at least slightly reduce it, but what's the likelihood of various levels of reduction and levels of increase in risk from this intervention. Precise answers seem unattainable. These are not questions where you can be like, oh, it is 40%. That's the correct number. But can we get a bit less imprecise? Right now, I would have a pretty hard time answering that, and probably most of you would have an even harder time answering it. I just want us to be a little less blind, just a little bit less stupid, a little bit more informed. And I think that is achievable. I'm very confident that's achievable. So some methods for answering those questions. One would be experts' intuitions, people who've been working on this topic for a while. They know a lot about it. They've got mental models of how it works. They understand the actors involved. They might have good intuitions on how likely the various risks are, how interventions would affect things. Another is qualitative research, like case studies, literature reviews. Another is quantitative models that try to map out what would be required for something to happen, how likely various things are, how large various variables are, like the numbers of weapons used given set scenarios. But the things I'm focusing on today are quantitative forecasts and rationales for quantitative forecasts. If anyone's familiar with Philip Tetlock's work, that's sort of a big part of the grounding for this. He's a political scientist who's looked at how to make how useful forecasting is, how to do good forecasting, how useful it is between different domains. That's sort of the grandfather of a lot of this work. Rationales for quantitative forecasts, what I mean by that is, so quantitative forecasts I just mean you ask someone a precise question and you get a number back as to either how likely they think something is, or their sort of distribution over the magnitude of something. So you could ask, conditional on nuclear war between the US and Russia, how many bombs will be dropped? So that's not a binary likelihood question. That's instead a question where the answer might be 800 or something. Or it might be 5% chance of 10, 20% chance of 400, etc. So they have a sort of distribution over the variable. Or how much smoke will be produced, things like that. So the rationales for quantitative forecasts, what I mean by that is you ask forecasters, why did you say that number? And this can be basically a really good method of qualitative research. It's sort of like expert intuitions. You've got a new type of expert who's thinking in a different type of way, and it's a complement to that. And you can ask, and then they might tell you the sources they consulted, the quantitative models they built or found, the arguments for and against they had, and they often have an interesting way of thinking that's nice and precise and laid out. They might give you good factorization. So you ask them, how likely is nuclear war? And you get back, well, here are what I saw as the 5 main pathways. Here's how I split up those main pathways. Here's how important I thought each one was. That now, it's not just helping you with the number, it's helping you understand what the risk pathways are and what the points of intervention are. So it can give you a qualitative understanding. Forecasting can be used as a way into a qualitative understanding as well as quantitative. Both are really important. This is, by the way, this is just my quick personal like Michael's homebrew taxonomy. It's not like necessarily like the taxonomy of research methods, but I think it's decent. You can also get aggregations of these, literature reviews, expert surveys, aggregate forecasts from 1,000 forecasters, etc. So which one should you use? My take is each method is horrifically flawed and massively inadequate for the task we have at hand, but in not fully correlated ways. And that's our like cheat code, is they're all crap, but differently crap. They have different failure modes. And so if we use multiple of them, we'll be less stupid than we were before and less stupid than other people. And that's the best we can go for, really. We're doing difficult things here, but someone has to do it. We can't just be like, oh, well, we can't get answers, let's give up, because if everyone gave up, then we'd all die probably. So we've got to go for it, we've got to do the best we can, and the best we can is probably a mix of the 5. An analogy is like, there's like I think it's like a common thought experiment or something, where the idea is if you think you might have a disease, you take one test for the disease. The test says you probably do have it, but it might be a false positive. You might actually not have the disease, and the test is just coming up wrong. If you take the same test again, you get some new info, because it might have been wrong for noise-related reasons. It might have been randomly flawed. But if you take the same test again, you don't get much new info, because it might just be making the same mistake the second time. There might be some other thing you've got going on that like flags the test as a positive. If you take a very different test or a very different line of evidence, you get much more. This is called consilience of evidence, generally speaking. So the more you have like uncorrelated methods that are all kind of shitty, but in uncorrelated ways, the better. So my suggestion is to use multiple, see what they converge on. And if they don't converge, that's useful info too. You don't want to like use one method, be very confident in the answer without checking the other ones would say something very different. If they differ, try to figure out why, and be less confident. Okay, so some options for getting individual quantitative forecasts. As I said, this is kind of a Frankenstein, so there's like a kind of weird structure to this, but just come with me for the journey and there'll be breaks for questions at various points. One thing is making them yourself. So the idea is now, I've convinced you, you're all like, oh yeah, great, we should use quantitative forecasts alongside other things. This is great, I'm on board. How do you do that? One is you make the forecast yourself. Another is crowdsourced forecasting sites like Metaculus, where anyone can put up a question, pretty much, and there's also a bunch of questions up there already, and then anyone can make forecasts. And then people's track records are tracked, and they get more weight. Their forecasts get more weight if they've done better. So you can go onto Metaculus and either find the existing questions or put up new questions, or there's other sites as well, and get what the community seems to believe. This is a pretty cheap way. You don't really have to pay anyone. You get sort of weird data from random nerds and stuff, but the random nerds, a lot of them are pretty good at this thing, and also if they're not very good at it, they get less weight. And it gives them points, and nerds love points, so it works out really well. Forecasting tournaments with financial prizes. So I did this on Metaculus. If you want to incentivize, if you want to focus their attention on certain questions, there's like a lot of questions on Metaculus about like various celebrities and Elon Musk and stuff like that. That absorbs a lot of the attention. I'm like, no, come over here. I need you to work on this nuclear risk stuff so I can inform policymakers. You can like chuck some money on there and make a big fanfare about why these results are going to be useful and get them to focus. And also more incentivize correct answers by giving money to the people with the best track record in this tournament. Prediction markets similarly incentivizes it financially. It's sort of like the stock market, but you're like trading probabilities of certain things basically, and you make money by doing well. Sometimes they also have fake points because various regulations, but don't worry about that. Another thing is you can commission forecasts from forecasters with strong track records. So you might be worried, okay, yeah, let's say I put on Metaculus a question on like how likely is it the nuclear war kills everyone. These nerds aren't going to be motivated by the points or by the money, because if everyone dies, then they don't get their money or their points, and no one gets to look how well they did. But instead you can find the people who've already done a good job many times, and then just pay them up front to forecast. And you just sort of hope that basically that they want to maintain a good reputation, a good track record, and if they do like a clearly weird-looking forecast, they won't get that. Also, these people appear to be very motivated by just like finding true answers and stuff like that. They seem to find it very interesting. So you just pay them up front, buy their time, they do this work. You can also solicit their rationales, again, in various ways to like incentivize them to tell you like how did you arrive at that answer, what sources did you consult. And an example question, just to make it more concrete, 2 example questions from a tournament I made. So one is, will it be at least one fatality from an offensive nuclear detonation in the US, UK, or France by 2030 if there's an offensive detonation anywhere by then? This is a weird sentence because you've got to like write very precise operationalized things. So it's like if someone launches a nuclear weapon, it's not a test, it's not just test detonation, then how likely is it it hits at least one of those countries? At least one weapon hits at least one of those countries. This is to help you get at like which country should we focus on? Is it just going to be India, Pakistan or something? Or is there just going to be a bomb on North Korea? Or is it also going to come to the US, UK, or France? And you can write a bunch of these questions and then figure out that that's an input, there's one input into which countries to focus on. To focus on reducing the arsenal sizes of, or improving the resilience of, or improving diplomacy efforts and reducing war chances of, etc. And also, will a state test a nuclear weapon with a yield above 30 megatons by 2030? So currently, the biggest nuclear weapons probably have low megaton yields, like in the low megatons, and most nuclear weapons have a few hundred kilotons. The Hiroshima bomb was 16 kilotons. So this would be one with something like 2,000 times the explosive power of the Hiroshima bomb. That increases nuclear winter risk if there's a lot of these weapons, because there's like huge fires, probably. So this is one way, again, it's one input. Usually you want to write like 10 questions that get at the same idea from different angles, and also do other research, and get a sense of like how likely is it there'll be huge arsenals with huge individual weapons, which countries, etc. Okay, I'm going to do a quick sort of like Q&A break here to check if you're all with me before we head into sort of the next chapter. So yeah, please, if you have any questions at this point, please pop up your hand. We'll do like 2-ish minutes of that, and then Sam will come around with the mic.
I don't know whether you're going to cover this later or not, but do you have any thoughts on the reciprocal scoring method that's starting to be used in like the hybrid tournament by UPenn and that kind of stuff for existential risks?
Yeah, so to catch other people up, Philip Tetlock is now, very excitingly, he was like the leading person on forecasting, and now he's focused on existential risk as well, which is, I don't know if he's primarily focused, but he's partly focused on it. So like the EA community excited him, and he's now like focused on these things, and he's running this tournament focused on existential risk forecasting with like cutting edge forecasting methods. And one of the things is reciprocal scoring, which is basically two groups of super forecasters who've like been demonstrated having good track records, try to predict what the other group will say basically. And they're not allowed to communicate at all. And the idea is the Schelling point, the like game theoretic point that they'll all converge to, it doesn't matter if you don't know that term, is just the truth, because they have no other thing to coordinate on. So they both just think like, okay, my best guess is the other group's going to do the truth because we're both trying to predict each other. And so the idea is, for things that you can't check what's true and then reward them, like whether we all die, you get them to forecast what each other think. I don't know. I think it's definitely worth trying. Some people worry because like it's not like the best incentive method. To be honest, I think incentive methods might not matter that much, because these people just like, they're just like intellectually hungry, and they like status, and they like the game, and they like feeling like they were correct and stuff like that. Like if you imagine like a standard EA-aligned researcher type person, they're often kind of like that. And so it doesn't matter that much exactly what scoring system you give them, I think, as long as you give them like interesting questions and like a good way to show that they seemed smart and cool, cool in their particular way. Yeah, but yeah, this is being under investigation. They also did like one pilot study where they found that it seemed to correlate with what was true. They did it with COVID, reciprocal scoring, where they then could later check what happened. And I think it turned out to seem correct, but I can't remember the details. I haven't read the paper. Maybe one more, and then I'll move on.
Yes, hi. So, hello. I am very interested, as you may know, in aggregating. You talked about the 5 different crappy methods. I'm very interested in aggregation of different estimates using those methods, and I know you are as well. I'm just wondering, what's the latest here on like literature reviews, databases, projects to integrate those? Maybe you're about to talk about that, but I don't know if you have any recommendations.
Yes, I think unfortunately the latest is like a thing I quickly did in 2020, and I know how to make it better. And later I'll cover how to make it better. And if someone wants to make it better and wants a grant for that, and it seems like you do a good job of that, like I can probably make sure you get that grant and do that and give you like light touch mentorship. But currently I think there's not much really. But it's pretty easy. Like you just find the things, put them together, like find some ways of like extrapolating from them. But yeah, I'll talk about that. I think it's a good question, but that comes up in chapter 3. We're about to enter chapter 2 of this Frankenstein. Cool, so challenges with existential risk estimates. Some of you are probably thinking, I don't know, like, there's all these problems. Yeah, there are problems. I'm going to talk about them. Hard to avoid issues. These are we just have to deal with them. There's not much of a way to get around them. One is it's hard to get relevant evidence to inform these estimates. So especially the ones that are closest to what we care about. What we care about most is permanent things that you can never come back from. We've never seen that before, obviously. So we can't get a precisely correct reference class of prior events like this. We just have to deal with that. But if you build a model of like the path there, some of the steps have happened. So one of the paths on the nuclear risk thing is a false alarm. False alarms have happened, and we can see how often they've happened, why they've happened, what they've led to. So if you build a model, you can check some of the individual steps, but you can't check the whole thing, unfortunately. So this sucks, but it's not a deal breaker. And this, yeah, okay, we'll get to that. How reliable are long-range predictions? We just don't have much evidence on this. A lot of people just assume they are zero reliability. I think that's stupid. I'll cover that later. But I think they probably are low, which just sucks. But yeah, I'll talk about the counters to these later. I'll try to refrain from talking about it now. Even short-range predictions are often unreliable. This is also true, especially from people you haven't checked their track record. Even 1-year predictions of normal things, people often kind of suck. Yeah, at least if we have a small number of predictors and they don't have strong track records. I'll come back to that later. Issues we can overcome more easily. Do these estimators have a good track record? If they don't, then they're probably going to do bad forecasts. But we can overcome that, obviously. We often have few estimators, just a small number, and that means we don't get the benefits of aggregation and different perspectives. Estimates might not be independent. So there's a lot of different existential risk estimates out there, less than I'd like, but a lot. They often have similar answers, but is that because people actually, is that just because that's the correct answer, or have they all read each other's work? A lot of them work at the same organization in Oxford, so they probably just had a lot of lunchroom conversations and converged, or hired people who think like them. Yeah, estimates we get are a biased sample, because they probably are a biased sample, because probably the people most inclined to work on these issues are the people relatively worried about it. The estimates are often not from the most worried people. There's other people who sound like they think it's almost 100% doom, but they don't put numbers on it. It's not the most worried people. Also, the general public often say crazy high numbers of the chance we die, and I think they just haven't thought it through. But it's probably somewhat biased towards worried people. People who are really smart and think in really good ways, but just assume existential risk is less likely, are more likely to end up in animal welfare or something, for example. Many estimates are just quick guesses, just someone answered off the cuff in a podcast or something. And precisely what is being estimated. Often it's kind of different things. Sometimes existential risk, sometimes it's extinction risk. Those are two pretty different things. Sometimes it's all existential risk, sometimes just one pathway. Sometimes it's by 2100, 2120, in the next 10 years. You've got to make sure that you're not misinterpreting the thing and just assuming, oh, they said 20%. It's 20%. 20% what? So why pay attention? Alternative options all suck. Everything sucks. We just got to do the best we can. You could have no beliefs about likelihoods. You could be well, I just don't know. I'm just going to do stuff. That just doesn't make sense. There's philosophical / economics arguments for why that just isn't rational. But the basic thing is just, if you're making a decision, you're implicitly assuming that one thing is more important than another thing. One factor in that is how likely are various things to happen and what will be the effects. So you implicitly have beliefs about these things. You're acting as if you do. So explicitly having the beliefs and having them be well informed is probably better. Having them be less terribly informed than currently is probably better than just doing stuff. Ignore beliefs about likelihoods from anyone but you. That's one option. You could have beliefs about likelihoods, but be I'm just going to have my beliefs about likelihoods. I can't. I think a lot of people do have a thing like that. They're these expert forecasts. There's no reason to trust them. But I think it's about 10%, so I'm going to go with that. All the reasons you shouldn't trust them pretty much apply to you as well. And you're one person, so you're not a crowd, and you're maybe less informed and stuff. It's better to have your beliefs, but also have other people's. You should form your own beliefs. I definitely believe that. But you should also check other people's. Just avoid quantitative estimates. So you could still pay attention to people being this is likely, this is unlikely, this is plausible, etc., but not pay attention to the numbers. Basically, I just think sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. One issue is plausible can mean different things to different people. Sometimes people think it means 2%, sometimes people think it means 50%. These terms, a lot gets lost in translation. So again, this is my key theme is all that's required, or one of my two key themes, all that's required to make X-risk estimates useful is that they make us a little less blind. It's like that, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king or something. That's sort of what we're going for. We just want one eye, 0.1 of an eye, just anything. Yeah, and I'm just saying this should be one of the tools we use. That's my other main theme. And another reason to pay attention, second reason, the track records of short-term forecasting is actually pretty good. So this is a graph from Metaculus. It's probably really hard to read. But basically what it's showing is when Metaculus says something's 25% likely, it happens about 20% of the time. When Metaculus says something's about 50% likely, it happens about 52% of the time, 75%, it happens about 80% of the time. So they're pretty close. So out of the 100 times that the average forecasts have been 25%, out of those times, about 20% have happened. So they're pretty good. They're not perfect, but if they were on the line to be perfect, they're pretty close to the line. This is short term. This is not everyone dies stuff, but still, it's some evidence. Especially if you get the right forecasters, the right approaches to aggregation to forecasting, and especially given large numbers of forecasters. So yeah, you can also see Tetlock's work for some examples of track records there. Another reason to pay attention, the third reason, I think it's the last reason, is it seems unlikely to me that long-range forecasts with good forecasters and approaches would be literally no better than random chance. I don't see why, if short-range forecasting is pretty good, long-range forecasting at some point would become zero good, would become pointless, completely useless. I think it would probably just gradually taper to being less useful, and maybe asymptote at some point, roughly asymptote, as in like it doesn't go to zero probably. It probably goes like increasingly close to zero, but never quite there. And there are a couple bits of weak evidence that I think are roughly supporting this. There's like two. The state of the literature is terrible. But what we have seems roughly in line with what I would guess. There's one blog post by a volunteer at my organization who spent like 3 weeks on it. That's one of the two main things. And that seems to roughly show that, yeah, it sort of like gets worse, but then it kind of like tapers and it doesn't get too bad. Another one is a footnote in a post by Luke Muehlhauser, which again like shows kind of the same thing. He uses Tetlock's data, but a bit that wasn't in Tetlock's books, and it seems to do that sort of tapering thing. Now, I'm not confident. It has not much evidence, but what we have seems to be in line with that, and someone could gather more evidence and check. And Tetlock, hopefully we can follow up on Tetlock's data and check. And we can avoid or work around many of the challenges or problems mentioned before. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. I kind of like spoiled some of this earlier, but yeah. Do these estimators have a good track record? That's one of the challenges, but we could get forecasts from forecasters with good track records, and then we get around that. We can weight forecasts differently based on track records. We can use and have the forecasters use best practices for aggregation, for forecasting, etc. We often have few estimators. That's another problem. But we can get lots. We can get around that. Estimates might not be independent. We can get them to estimate independently. We can get them to not share their reasoning until the end in various ways, with incentives and with like blocking them from doing so. The estimates we get are a biased sample because the people who are motivated to estimate are often the people who are most worried. We can get other ways to motivate people, like incentives, points, money, etc. And we can aggregate lots of estimates to avoid that. Many estimates are just quick guesses. We can get thoughtful, incentivized estimates from skilled people using good approaches by showing them why this is impactful, as well as like putting money on the line, as well as putting puts on the line, etc. And precisely what's being estimated, we can just track that carefully. Make clear, decision-relevant questions, and make sure that when people are interpreting the questions, we keep reminding them, like, actually read the question, pay attention to the caveats. And we can get rationales from them that explain what they were thinking when they answered the question. Best practices for making forecasts. I'm just going to skip this. I think this is probably one of the most interesting topics, but this isn't my forte, and I didn't have time to like write about it. But some things I recommend. There's a thing called Recipe for Making Predictions. At the end, I'll show you like a short link to these slides, so you can like follow the link in the slides. And there's also something called 10 Commandments for Aspiring Super Forecasters. These two things are like nice resources on just the practice of forecasting, and you can also practice at Metaculars. You can just like try. I'll pause again here, yeah, for like a brief question bit.
Thanks. Interested in your reflections on using the track record of predictors across different domains. So for example, you talked about people predicting celebrity gossip, how transferable skills in one area might be to the questions around existential risk.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So one thing I've done, a separate thing you can do is you can try to use the track record from the relevant domain. So I showed you Metaculus as a whole, which is like a crazy smorgasbord of different questions. But I've also checked the nuclear risk questions that are resolved and the armed conflict questions that are resolved and a couple other tags that are relevant. And the track record seems about as good on those. So one thing is you can check the most relevant subset of questions. Then you have less data, but it's more relevant data, more transferable. The other thing is, yeah, I don't know. I think this is one of the important questions to be investigated. It might have been investigated, I just don't know. I think there's been a little bit of work that seems to show good forecasters seem to be, okay. A key thing is there's two different things, resolution and calibration. Resolution is how close are you to 100% when it is going to happen, and how close are you to 0 when it's not going to happen. So it's like how much signal do you provide, or something like that. How confident can you be justifiably? Calibration is how close is your percentage to like what it should be, or something. Like how good are you at noticing your uncertainty? So when you say 80%, does it actually happen 80% of the time? 20% does it happen 20% of the time? I don't think I explained that very well, but hopefully you get the vague idea. I think calibration should transfer. Because people should, you get good at noticing how uncertain you feel and like being able to turn your like feeling of uncertainty into a number and having the right number for different situations. Resolution, and one way to be very calibrated is just say 50% all the time or something like that. Resolution probably doesn't transfer as well, because resolution really uses your domain knowledge. Knowing a lot about a topic and knowing how it works can help you have like good forecast in the right direction rather than just knowing how uncertain you are. And one could just look into how well forecasting track records transfer against other domains we don't really care about. And if in like 10 times we check for 2 domains we don't really care about and it always transfers and they're very different, probably it will also transfer to the domain we do care about. I don't know if that's been done, but it would be cool. If it hasn't been done, someone can get a grant and do it. I'd like that. Maybe one more at this break.
If no one has another question, I might make a question. If I'm like someone from a somewhat quantitative background, how long do you think that it would take one to heads down, thumbs up, get better at forecasting to eventually become useful?
Yeah. So I think partly this is like certain people seem predisposed to be really good at it. There's like certain styles of thinking and types of people that seem good at this. So one thing is just like try it for, I don't know, 10 hours. And if it's going well so far, then maybe you're one of those people and you should keep going at it. And if it's not going well at all and you don't like it, then maybe like drop it and focus on other things. I don't think like people are like irredeemably bad at it or something, but like some people are just like more suited. Then the other thing is I think just like lots of practice and getting the feedback loops. So trying to practice on like questions that resolve soon is really helpful. So don't do all your practice on extinction risk questions, because then you don't like get the feedback loops of how well you did. And then these resources. But then that's all about forecasting. There's another thing which is like aggregating and like researching how to do forecasting, researching how to get policymakers to pay attention, actually doing the advocacy of getting policymakers to pay attention, et cetera, funders to pay attention. So there's a lot of other bits of the ecosystem that you can do, even if you're like not most fired up about doing the forecasts. Cool. I'm going to do a like speed run of this third chapter because I think it's less interesting, and then we'll have like the open Q&A. So don't worry about this. Don't worry about this. Here's what I want to get to. Oh, it's very small, but I'll talk you through it. Everything I've said so far is like why to care about forecasting, why to care about prioritization and using forecasts for that and using aggregates for it and like the challenges of those and how to overcome them. Then this final thing is the aggregation bit. How should you aggregate it and why? I've skipped the why. Here's the how. In 2020, I did a very simple thing of I just made a Google sheet and I just put in all the estimates that were explicitly about existential risk or about things very relevant to existential risk, like the chance of a huge nuclear war, not just things like the chance of any nuclear war or whatever. And I just put it in with like who made the forecast, when did they make it, what was the question, what was their prediction, what's the source, and then a couple like other things and notes and stuff. And then now you can just sort of eyeball this and you can see them all in one place. And I think this is a very useful resource. And I claim that basically anyone interested in choosing EA cause areas should spend like at least an hour sort of like perusing this database. Because I think it's just like is one important source. It's not the only source, but it's one important source into whether you should focus on existential risk, which I think everyone should consider that question at some point, and also what existential risk to focus on and how to work on it. So it tries to aggregate it all together. But you could do better. Recently, I've sort of drafted a better version. It's just on nuclear risk, but you could do the same methods for other things, which does the same stuff. This is completely impossible to see, but a key thing that it does is also everyone's estimating different things with different timelines. But you could convert it into some common currencies. So I think two of the key variables are what is the chance of nuclear war by 2100? What is the chance of nuclear war per year? More than two things. And how much does nuclear war contribute to existential risk by 2100? How much higher is existential risk because nuclear war is possible than if it wasn't possible by 2100? You can take all these other estimates that people have made and use some like factors to like change the timelines, to change it from accident risk to total risk, to change it from just US and Russia to all risk and stuff. And then get like, now you've sort of extrapolated your way to having a large number of estimates on the things you most care about. This is not like scientifically validated or something, but the reasoning seems sound. It probably makes us a bit less stupid. And then you can just make it very transparent what you've done. So there's like a tab where I explain all the conversion factors I've done. We could do this with existential risk as a whole. We could do this for various different specific existential risks. This is a way to bootstrap ourselves to having way more forecasts. You can also add weight. So how much weight would I give them? Based on like how many people forecasted, how good was their track record, how much reason do I have to believe they're biased. So some of these are from like random crappy little think tanks that are clearly alarmist, and so I give them little weight versus like 500 people on Metaculus with a financial prize. And then, here we go. Here's like one piece of actual object level info from this. Now that I've done this, and now don't put much weight on these numbers. I'm not saying like this is the correct answer, but this is like a starting point. It appears, based on doing, also using median, arithmetic mean, and geometric mean. Doesn't matter if you know what arithmetic or geometric mean are. I don't really know. But apparently there's reason to believe one of them is better than the other. It's unclear which one. Let's just put both in and see what happens. So per year chance of any nuclear conflict appears to be roughly 1%. Like a lot of different estimates extrapolated together, a lot of different ways of aggregating them, converges on something vaguely like 1%. And the range in this database, this work in progress database, is from 0.3% to 6%. So it's not like an extremely huge range. We can be decently confident that it's vaguely in the ballpark of 1% chance per year. It's probably not 20%. It's probably not 0.1%. The chance of nuclear conflict by 2100 seems to be somewhere around 50%. And then there's also in the database like how much it contributes to existential risk, which I think was like 0.5%, that's meaningful to me. Like if it contributes about 0.5%, that's useful info. That seems like notably below AI risk, but not way below. And that's like reason to believe this is a pretty big deal. And I'm now a bit more confident that it's a pretty big deal, but not the hugest deal based on this. It's just one line of evidence, but it helps me a bit. My intended next steps, get useful feedback on this, get an RA to help me turn the existential risk database into this, the overall one, finish populating it, make it better, make it clearer, write a post that explains it, etc. And someone in this room could, in theory, do that, or maybe you know someone who can. Don't worry about this. Maybe we'll get back to it in the questions. So here's my question for you. Should you make and use existential risk estimates, and how? This is about, like, you can actually do this. Don't just see this as interesting ideas. And I don't know the best way. Like, if anyone wants these slides, this is the link to get to the slides. And then there's a bunch of other resources in there. So, like, if you want, take a photo of that now, and you can use that. And then I'll switch to the Q&A slide. I've now monopolized the short link for X-risk estimates. So sorry if anyone else wanted that. I felt a bit bad about it, but I'm like, you can use tiny URL. It'll be fine. I've only taken the bit.ly. Cool. So we've now concluded the meandering Frankenstein, and we can go to full Q&A on whatever you want.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Round of applause for Michael.
If you're blocked by the pillar, feel free to move.
So I'm glad you had an opportunity to ask questions like throughout the talk. But I guess one thing is that you pointed out earlier that making long-run forecasts of existential risk estimate is not the way to go. What are some of the methods that you use to try and inform long-range estimates, or other researchers have used by stuff that's a little bit more, I guess, calibratable?
Do you mean that long-range forecasts aren't the way to go to practice forecasting?
I kind of was curious stuff like the short-run questions in Philip Tetlock's work and what type of questions those are, and how that would inform like the long-run forecast.
Yeah, so I would put like three broad buckets of what we're interested in asking about, which are like how likely is existential risk, how likely is each existential risk and pathway, and like what effects would various interventions have. And then for each of those, there's like a billion sub-questions with differing importance. So one thing is the short-range questions can help us get a sense of who has a good track record. And my guess is that track record on short-range questions will somewhat generalize track record on long-range. And someone could also investigate that by checking people with good short-range track records and like seeing how they do after 10 years. We can check 10 years. So yeah, one thing is it helps us find the good people and then give them the most important questions. Another thing is it can help us with some of the risk pathways. Like as I said, some of the variables, some of the things along the pathway recur. So like one relevant thing is how often will the US and China have various diplomatic spats or something? And we can check that over the next 5 years, and then that will still it will give us some grounding for what will happen in 2030 to 2035 as like AI is taking off and things like that. And then the final thing where short range is probably most useful is a lot of interventions happen in the short range. So for example, like we can check if we do this now, will it in 2 years have the intended effect? Like, will this policy get passed? Will this policy lead to a reduction in arsenal sizes and stuff like that? That doesn't directly tell us how it affects existential risk, but if we have reason to believe that these effects are good or bad, we can check, like, do forecasters think these effects will happen? And that can be a short-range question. We can also do things like, I guess a fourth category is understanding the landscape. So we can understand, like, which agencies and departments will, like, stop existing. Like one of the main AI-relevant agencies in the US is called the JAIC, and I think it's going out of existence soon. So if a lot of people were focused on, like, trying to get into the JAIC and rise up the ranks, learning that it was going to stop existing might reduce the value of that pathway. And so learning which like agencies and departments we should focus on getting people into, which who the relevant players will be, that's also relevant for our efforts to, like, navigate the landscape and reduce the risks.
Brilliant. I think one of the first expositions that we Effective Ultras had to existential risk estimates was, of course, Toby Ord's book, The Precipice. I think we were talking about appendices to The Precipice earlier. But would it be possible for you to give an inside view of the thinking that Toby Ord had in creating those estimates?
Not really. I think The Precipice is a great book. One thing I wish it did was explain how he arrived at his estimates. I do think his estimate should get more weight than, like, probably any other one person's estimates on existential risk. But I'd give it more weight if I knew how he arrived at it. Like, what was his breakdown? What was his modeling? What was his Fermi estimate? I think probably, like, one thing that I didn't really cover is how to make good estimates. I think usually a good way to make good estimates is to do, again, mixed methods. Like, the forecasters themselves should also use a variety of shitty methods and see what they converge on. And one would be, like, having an explicit model. Another is, like, intuitions and reference classes. And I imagine Toby Ord used a mix of, like, explicit quantitative models that, like, show the variables and, like, add up the various factors and stuff, as well as, like, just, like, his intuitive sense after reading all the things, as well as reference classes, as well as asking other people. But unfortunately, he doesn't report it, so I don't really know.
I think you were mentioning that forecasting estimates could be used to influence policy decisions. And I'm very interested if you know, like, what initiatives are in that area, or if there are any initiatives that you'd like to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a fair bit going on now. I should have checked before this, like, which things are non-public versus public, so I'll be kind of vague just in case. But there's at least one thing happening in a European country where it's a relatively big project that is, they have really good connections in the relevant European government, and they have like a decent amount of forecasting knowledge, and they're, like, quite EA motivated, and they're practicing different methods of involving policymakers in the entire forecasting process. So the policymakers help set the questions, both to actually get relevant questions and just to be like, oh, you helped make this, therefore you like it, because they like to be bought in from early on, and and then checking how to get them used by them later, and, like, checking how well that worked. And a big part of the idea there, is to then take the lessons, write them up, explain them to EA-aligned people in other countries, and try to use those insights elsewhere. Because this country is not the most important, but we can learn things there. There's also so the CSET, there's a DC-based think tank that is, like, interested in various EA areas. They're not an EA think tank, but they're interested in EA areas. They have a thing called Foretell. I think it's now moved out of CSET and rebranded. But yeah, that was aimed at trying to use their existing brand and prestige among policymakers, and use, like, nice graphic design and stuff like that, like just nice things to make it look pretty, and break down these topics in a very clear way and show the sort of map from the thing policymakers most care about to, like, the breakdown to the individual questions, as, again, an experiment in seeing if policymakers could care. So there's a bunch of projects like this, either to be directly useful or to, like, check methods so that we can use them later when, like, things really start kicking off in various EA relevant areas.
Brilliant. I think earlier in the talk you mentioned that you'd improved the existential risk estimates for nuclear war, and you'd be interested in seeing it improved in the same way for the other cause areas, and possibly even providing funds to do that. Are there any other particularly low-hanging fruit that you would like to see if, like, someone would be interested in picking it up in this room?
Yeah. So I think I guess the broad buckets are, like, improving our forecasting methods. So things like reciprocal scoring, like checking if reciprocal scoring works and how well it works, checking different, like, training programs for forecasters and seeing which ones just empirically lead to the best improvements in track records. Another thing is checking just, like, research on how good forecasting is and how that differs across domains. So some of the things I mentioned earlier about, like, checking how short-range track records extrapolate to, like, medium range and then hoping that extrapolates to long range, or checking how track records in one domain affects another, like predicts track records in another. So yeah, first bucket is, like, improving our forecasting method. Second bucket is, like, checking how much weight we should put on forecasts of various kinds. A third bucket is just getting better estimates on various things. So this would be like running tournaments, like finding ways of recruiting forecasters. So Metaculus could have way more people involved in theory. There could be like EA community building, but instead forecasting community building. You don't need to buy them to EA ideas. You need to get them excited about forecasting, pump them into Metaculus, pump them into the highest value questions, and like produce way more of the best estimates, and also find some of the best people. And another one is, like trying to find methods to get it used by policymakers, or like various decision makers. I focused on policymakers, but also like the Gates Foundation, for example. If we got them to use forecast, that would presumably improve their decision making. And then finally, like the bucket of actually getting it used by the decision makers. And I think in each of those buckets, there are low-hanging fruit that just some person can relatively, like a talented person can relatively easily do like part-time for a couple months and make it better, because just this is such uncharted territory. But there's also things where you can like skill up a lot and like get a job and like dive deep and make this your career. And I don't have a hot take on which one to prioritize. It will depend on the person.
Brilliant. I get this in this talk. We're trying to pull people in mainly into the area of forecasting, but I'd be interested whether you're excited about any like improvements on initiatives within forecasting technology.
Could you give me an example of the sort of thing you mean?
I think that there's like recently been some development on manifold markets, and like I guess query's doing a little bit there too. Is there anything like that you'd appreciate to see an improvement of like a Metaculus platform or something like that?
Yeah, my hot take is, I've done a bit of grant making related to forecasting and a bit of advising of forecasting orgs. I haven't run a forecasting org project, and I haven't actually done much forecasting myself. So yeah, I've got like a weird mix of like I know a lot and I don't know much. My hot take is that technology is not the key thing. There's a bunch of tech things that could be useful, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is basically getting more people to actually do this, and getting a nice pipeline for them to do it, and getting, in particular, a nice pipeline to make this really easy for decision makers. So there's a lot of people who are very busy, and they aren't very experienced with writing forecasting questions or figuring out how forecasting is useful for them, or using the forecasting results, but they would find it useful. The current method is like they just write questions from they figure out what to ask about, they write the question, they get the forecasters involved, they figure out how to interpret the answers, they do this, and for any decision, there'll be like 100 different questions you should answer, like should use in a structured way. So if someone instead made a pipeline where it's way easier, so we need something like research assistants who like write forecasting questions, who like really understand EA priorities, and I can just like hand you my in standard normal English high level question that I really care about, and they can come up with like the breakdown that like maps it out explicitly and how all the things feed into each other. And if I can just give you that high level thing, you do all that work for me, you come back to me with like a bunch of answers aggregated and like written up in a report that makes it clear how I should interpret the implications. And then you can do that for funders, for researchers, for policymakers, etc. That seems like the most valuable thing, and I think this is basically like manual human labor. I do think there are tech things that would be useful as well, though. You can think of like the workflow of a forecaster and how to automate various bits of it, like making it easier for you to find other related questions, or finding evidence sources, or making it easier to input probability distributions, or to make a like quantitative model that's like nice and intuitive and like visual and stuff. So I think that tech can help, but I think the key thing is it's not, I don't think it's fancy tech. I think it's more like product development to make it like a smooth workflow for the forecasters and especially for decision makers. The reason I say especially decision makers, there's just fewer of them, and they're harder to like make new ones of. Forecasters in theory, we could just like round up a whole bunch of nerds and make it interesting and pay them. And we don't need to just like find the small number of people we vetted for like 10 years and who've gotten the trust of relevant people.
Brilliant. I'm just running off my questions now because I'm fascinated in this topic myself. But considering that you did your work on nuclear risk estimates, and that I believe that did update your view on how important nuclear risk was, if you were to actually do a forecast, how likely would you think that, for instance, AI safety is the most likely existential risk?
So I think AI risk is the most likely existential risk. And then how confident am I? Yeah, I don't know. I think also, so one thing that I think is a generally useful thing for effective altruism people, and is also relevant to this talk, is this idea of independent impressions versus all things considered beliefs. And I think you should walk around with both all the time. Where independent impressions is like, what would I believe if I wasn't deferring to anyone? I wasn't like updating on the fact Michael said this or whatever. And then your all things considered belief is both your independent impression plus what other people say. When you're actually making decisions, I suggest you use your all things considered belief and you take into account Toby Ord said this, Eliezer Yudkowsky said this, Michael said this, give less weight on me. But you also need to track your own beliefs so that the community isn't just all following each other, and also so you like have the beliefs where you've like understood the pathways and the mechanisms involved, not just like understanding the number and trying to like act on it blindly in like a sort of black box way. So in light of that, but I haven't spent time making an independent impression of that particular question. So I'm like pretty confident, partly based on my own understanding, partly based on deference, that AI risk is the most important existential risk, but not like super confident. I guess there's also a question of, so maybe I'd be like, yeah, there's a question of like how confident means when I'm talking about a forecast. So I'm saying like, how confident am I that AI risk is the most likely? I think the most useful interpretation is like, what are the chances that if I spent 1,000 hours researching this, I would still have the same belief? And I think for that, I don't know, like 75% or something. And there's a different thing, which is like, what are the chances that it's true? And I don't really know how to interpret that. I don't know what answer to give. But like, yeah, I'm like confident enough that spending 1,000 hours deciding doesn't seem the top priority for me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that might be all we have time for.
Cool.
Michael Ed.
Thanks for coming.